I remember a time when the words expansion pack held a completely different meaning. A wonder that implied you could add a ton of fun content onto your favorite video games by spending your hard-earned money should you choose. It wasn't something developers typically thought of while working on their initial game. No, it was an afterthought, brought on by the success of their title, or by fan demand. Reasons that I'm sure many of us can get on board with. Happy enough with your dozens of Roller Coaster Tycoon maps and the current content the core game had to offer? Great, then there was no need to spend any more money, and you could just enjoy the core game. However, should you want more content and maps, it all came packed to the brim in a reasonably priced package at your local stores. This may not seem all that different from today's DLC, and in some regards it isn't. However, with the amount of garbage that's shoveled in today's games as extra paid content, I can't help but take shots at them. DLC or expansion packs should be an afterthought, meant to add quality content to an already successful game. I'm sorry, if there's DLC for some game on day one of its core game's release, I immediately lose a lot of respect for that game and whatever company produced it. Now, expansion packs aren't entirely guilt-free either, because there was some pretty bare-bones expansion kits back in the day as well. And while Half-Life Blue Shift does not technically fall under the expansion pack category, it is a relatively short game of its own. So why do I preface this video with expansion packs when the game in question is not technically an expansion pack in the start or end of its production? Perhaps it's just that in my mind the content is still relatable to an expansion pack, and it was meant to be an add-on to Half-Life in the first place. I choose to talk about this game more so for the interesting production journey it took, and why I think we ended up with the PC game that we got, as well as why I actually gave the final product a favorable pass regardless. Let's take a walk down memory lane, shall we? The original Half-Life was released to gamers on November 8th of 1998, to overwhelmingly positive reviews. Half-Life brought a lot to the table, a physics system that, while not first to the punch, was the first to do it right. Moreover, Half-Life brought a visually impressive product that put you firsthand in the shoes of silent protagonist Gordon Freeman, never leaving the first-person perspective, and telling the story of Black Mesa as if you were living it for yourself brought a whole new engaged experience to this first-person shooter. Couple that together with an impressive lineup of weapons, solid story and action puzzles to solve along the way, and you've got yourself a shiny new goldmine for those to witness the 1998 masterpiece. A goldmine that developer and publisher Valve and Sierra never even meant to dig any further into themselves. That is, until rookie company at the time, Gearbox Software, approached Valve about creating an expansion pack for the game. A sister game, if you will, that put the player in the shoes of the Marines that played some of the antagonists from the original Half-Life. Effectively, a bad guy's story taking place in the same time and place as Gordon Freeman's story. This brought Half-Life Opposing Force to fruition, an expansion pack to Half-Life that also experienced a warm reception and brought a lot to the table. Remember how we talked about an expansion pack adding a fair amount of content to its original game? Try this out for size. A whole new campaign, brought in by a separate company, bringing a lot of new content to the table, including new aliens, some of which being further evolved versions of the head crabs, a whole new arsenal of weapons, and completely different and interesting puzzles and events. To this day, I use this as a benchmark for what an expansion pack should be. It was completely worth your valuable time and money, and clocks in at about 2/3 of Half-Life's playtime at roughly 7 hours upon first playthrough. Next in line for Gearbox was to port Half-Life onto the Sega Dreamcast. Yes, the Dreamcast. Half-Life Gold was meant to be a double feature for the Dreamcast, bringing aboard the all-new Half-Life Blue Shift to be an exclusive campaign featured in the game, much like Half-Life Decay and the PS2 port of Half-Life, also by Gearbox. Unfortunately, Half-Life Gold was cancelled after the announcement that the Dreamcast would be discontinued, and who can blame them? Fun fact, the game was actually 99% complete, and is actually playable today through means of emulation or burning the ISO of the game to a disc. Jumping onto the speculation bandwagon for a second, my best guess with Blue Shift is that it either was not intended to be a very long campaign to begin with, or Gearbox rushed the project after the failure of its port to the Dreamcast, because the game itself was still very much alive, and now slated for a PC release soon after. And so it did release on June 12th of 2001, as a standalone PC video game unlike its counterpart Opposing Force. The saving grace, or rather saving graces, of this now standalone campaign was that it was never actually standalone. Every copy of Half-Life Blue Shift came with Half-Life Opposing Force alongside it, effectively buying yourself both Blue Shift and Opposing Force for less of the price that Half-Life itself was slated at. Of course, if you already owned Opposing Force, there was not much incentive to pay the price tag here, as low as it was. The other saving grace was that Blue Shift also offered a handy graphics upgrade to not only itself, but Opposing Force and Half-Life itself, should you also own that. As confusing as it is, here's how it was laid out. Half-Life could be played on its own, as could Blue Shift, but Opposing Force needed either Half-Life or Blue Shift in order to just be played. It begs the question why Opposing Force was not just a standalone game as well, but let's call that an oversight. Now that we have discussed the history of Half-Life Blue Shift, we'll move along to my thoughts on the game itself. A 2-for-1 video here, if you will, much like the game itself. You get it? Because Blue Shift came with Opposing Force, 2-for-1 game, 2-for-1 video. Never mind. What are my thoughts on Blue Shift itself? Honestly, I have a soft spot for this game, and I'm not even going to pull the nostalgia card on you because I played Half-Life in 2000, Blue Shift in 2008, and Opposing Force in 2010. Though I guess 2008 is 8 years ago at this point. Wow. Anyways, to me I think it's more of a factor that I love Half-Life, and the idea of experiencing Black Mesa from 2 other perspectives was something that I was extremely excited to even think about. And I waited 8 years to finally try one of these other campaigns, and I loved it. Sure, it was shorter, about a third of the playtime as Half-Life to get specific, but I don't think the bad rap it gets is entirely fair, although I can understand it. I think I played these 3 games in the right order. Half-Life was incredible, and Opposing Force set the bar even higher. Finally, years went by and Blue Shift came in to bring it back down to the same content as the original Half-Life, at a shorter playtime. Yeah, when you put it that way, it does feel like a cash grab. Though, as we discussed earlier, the journey that this game took to even come into existence really does explain why it is what it is. Personally, I'd rather it be released in what I consider as reasonable a manner as possible than not at all. At its core, Blue Shift is a short and sweet Half-Life campaign in the shoes of security guard Barney Calhoun, also going about his daily business at Black Mesa when, as we all know, everything goes wrong and aliens happen, and then G-Man conspiracies and US soldiers happen. We've done this song and dance, and we're going to do it all again with a different path to route. Calhoun crashes down in an elevator with 2 scientists, surviving the fall himself only to awake to the monsters now roaming the facility. Navigating the facility, Calhoun runs into fellow Black Mesa employees who explain that they have a plan to escape through teleportation to a safe location outside the facility, away from the army, similar to the device that teleported the aliens to Black Mesa in the first place. To do this, Calhoun must find scientist Dr. Rosenberg and escort him to the underground lab where the teleportation device is located. Once there, Calhoun is asked to go below the lab and get the power hooked up to the teleportation device. Of course, fighting off US soldiers, aliens, and figuring out puzzles. Once done this, Calhoun has to make his appearance on the alien planet Zen to re-establish a power connection there as well, for some reason. An excuse to go to Zen like Freeman, I guess. I didn't say this game wasn't flawed. Finally, once back at the lab, Calhoun has to assist the scientists in teleporting them out of Black Mesa and to a minivan where they escape. The game gives you one last scare with a technical malfunction that involves Calhoun teleporting all over the facility briefly, much like Freeman at the start of his journey. And hey, who is in one of these locations? Well, it's Gordon Freeman getting dragged away by the soldiers. You can witness it from a small window, and that's this game's nod to the original. Nice touch. Also, you can see Freeman and his rail car at the start of the Blue Shift campaign. Like I said, a short and sweet story that is interesting to say the least. Escaping in a minivan, not quite as epic as counterparts Freeman or Shepard. I do have to point out this game's flaws, because obviously they are there, and I can speculate on how unfinished or rushed it may have been, but it is what it is. We've been over the fact that the game is relatively short, clocking in at about 4 hours, or the lack of new aliens or weapons that appeared in Opposing Force before it that seemingly went dormant here. And I think that probably had to do with the assets not being there in Half-Life Gold, as it was going to be released as Half-Life plus Blue Shift, the Dreamcast title. Not only that, but some of the enemies from the original do not or barely make an appearance at all in Blue Shift. I think they're all there aside from some of the big bosses, if you will, in Half-Life, but some of them make as little as one appearance in the whole game. Furthermore, to the rushed or unfinished theory, make of it what you will. The puzzles never seem to drive up the stakes as much as its counterparts did either. Sure, you have a sewage grinder that you have to take out, but that's about it as far as fix this or you'll die puzzles. One last thing to mention is the difficulty spike. Holy hell, why is it that I can blast through easy or medium without much sense of extra difficulty, but hard mode likes to hide the health packs in to almost non-existence. I'm not even kidding here. There is one specific part of the game I can recall where there is 7 health kits in one room on medium difficulty. 7 health kits. On to the positives once again. It may not say much for it, but I really don't ever get that feeling where I feel like I'm playing a fan hack during this game. It feels largely like a professional and intentional installment into the franchise with some minor and even glaring flaws. However, that does not stop it from being an enjoyable experience. It feels enough the same as its counterparts while also feeling like its own game. I actually really like the whole idea of scientists and security guards banding together to concoct their escape out of the facility. That part of the game makes you feel like one of the gang, albeit your gang is a useless bunch of scientists that get you to defend them, but the feeling is still there. One thing to point out as well is that while playing as Gordon Freeman or Adrian Shepard in the other 2 games, both equipped with their respective power suits, you feel like an absolute powerhouse that can take on the world. However, with Calhoun you feel like a security guard that's just trying to beat the odds and find his way out. And I mean that in the best way possible. You feel weak. More is at stake and it feels easier to die. That may just be me, but I really like that for this installment. It feels real. It makes you plan out your attack. One cool quirk of this is that the armor function is a product of finding spare armor lying around the facility, whereas Shepard and Freeman both have charge stations for their suits. The puzzles in this game are as cool as ever still. While you may not come riding in on a conveyor of crates into a room full of Black Ops, there is some casually fun puzzles to solve, though some in particular are just strange. Let's fix this broken wire by pushing a barrel into the missing spots of the wire and kaboom. Sure. All in all, Half-Life Blue Shift is an enjoyable experience, and a decent first-person shooter game in its own right. I'm glad that it exists today, and while it may not offer as much as some would hope, it's worth it if you're really itching for some more adventures in Black Mesa. Today you can purchase any of the 3 games on Steam for respectable prices under $5 or $10. But wait for a sale and buy all 3 for $5 like I did years ago. If you cannot wait for that, play Opposing Force and the original first. They are still better games than Blue Shift without a doubt.